Hello, and welcome to the Launchpad Podcast by ACTO. This is a podcast for leaders in the life sciences world to help better respond to all the changes in the healthcare system and commercialize their patient-centric technologies more effectively. As we know, there's a lot changing in our world today. And as a leader myself, over the last few weeks and months now, I was struggling to figure out what is the right approach. How do I make sense out of the world? How do I support the team while managing all the different stakeholder expectations? And in all that struggle, it has also been a very insightful experience. One of the key insights came when I reached out to one of my friends and mentors. And I asked him, how do I make sense out of this world, Tim? And Tim's response, there were two words in his response that really resonated with me. And those two words were, be human. And to that end, I'm really excited to have my friend and dear mentor, Tim Cole, who is the CEO of the Compass Alliance and also author of one of my favorite books, The Compass Solution, on the call today and on this podcast to talk to us about the new model of leadership. And we're going to talk to Tim about all the things that are changing in the world, what Tim is seeing in the industry, in the life sciences industry. What does it take to be human today as a leader? And how do we respond to the new normal? And as a corollary of that, what does the new normal look like? So we'll get into a lot of these exciting discussions. Super excited to have Tim on the call today. Tim, I know I only gave a very brief overview because I just simply couldn't do justice to all the wealth of experience that you have and all the wonderful things that you do for leaders around the world. Specifically in the life sciences industry. Without further ado, Tim, I would love to pass it to you for you to share a little bit about your background and we'll get started.
Well, thank you, Parth. It's a pleasure to join you today. And I will tell you that I stumbled into life sciences and pharmaceuticals at the beginning of 1980. And it makes me feel a little bit humble to say I've been around for 40 years, but I have. I was not prepared for the career that I was getting ready to embark on. And the company I went to work for was very small. It was about a $79-80 million company per year. We became one of the 4 or 5 largest in the world. And along the way, I enjoyed an incredible experience. And there came a point after taking on a number of different responsibilities, most of which in management areas, I decided along about my 35th year to reflect on the scope of the journey. And I took that and built a book called The Compass Solution, A Guide to Winning Your Career. And I wrote the book because I realized when I reflected on the journey that there were two things that changed the trajectory for me. One was I had a very unusual experience in my first 2 years. I met one of the most endangered species in the corporate arena. I met a truly transformative leader. Now, people hear that and they go, well, that can't really be. It's true. They're very rare. And my interaction with that individual forever changed the trajectory of that career, number one. And then number two, we went through, I think, 5 mergers and 20-something restructures. There came a point when I realized there's no GPS for your career. You either build your own compass or you struggle. And the principles and the cardinal points that I used for my journey became the foundation for the book, The Compass Solution. In 2017, that book then became the foundation for my company, the Compass Alliance, all about, as you pointed out, people and leadership and culture.
Tim, thank you for sharing that. And what a fitting time to have that discussion where the very core and the foundation of the world as we know it has been shaken. And it's really easy to slip into the mindset of looking at the world through the balance sheet, especially when the financial worldview is so deeply challenged. And I guess that would be a good fitting place for us to start our discussion is in a world like that, how do you, when your Excel sheets are getting drenched in red and orange, and perhaps you're looking out a quarter or 2 quarters out from now and you simply don't have enough information. How do you take a human-centric approach in that world?
I think that's a great question, and it's the challenge for every senior leader today. I would tell you the first important point is to recognize there will be a future. There will be an after. And it's our responsibility as senior leaders to help forge that future, not simply wait for it to unfold. That's the first thing. The second thing I would tell you is that regardless of whether or not we have responsibilities for a balance sheet, and all of us do, there are still, as you pointed out, human aspects that will influence that balance sheet that oftentimes can be ignored in times of crisis. And I'll give you an example. For some of my workshops, we talk about some of the findings from past crises and what we carried forward from those. One of the facts I use is from the Gallup Group, and I think it's compelling. The Gallup Group's been around, as you know, for the better part of 8 decades. They published an article not long ago that said, hey, there are universal needs that all of us have in moments of adversity that we look to leaders to hopefully see some semblance of. And those things are not surprising, but oftentimes they disappear in moments of adversity. Number one, we look for a sense of trust from that leader. When everything else has suddenly fallen down around us, we hope to find someone that we can trust in. Number two, we look for a sense of compassion. Does this individual actually care about me, or are they simply totally focused on bottom line? The third thing we look for is stability, not surprising. And then the last piece, and maybe the most important, is we look for a sense of hope. And when I think about those things, it reminds me again, and you said it well, we are all around business strategy, but there's a human capital strategy, especially now, that may be most important. I pull a lot from history, as we've talked about before, and I'm always reminded, I think it was Aristotle that said there's 3 tenets of persuasion. There's ethos, which is ethics. There's logos, which is logic. But then there's pathos, which is emotion. We delve in a world that is heavy in ethics and logic and sometimes low on pathos. But it's pathos and emotion that's going to carry us through.
Absolutely. Tim, thank you for sharing that. And, you talk about hope. What does that internal dialogue look like for a leader who wants to strive to be that transformative leader? What does that internal dialogue look like when let's face it, there's a lot less to hope for today. We talk about the beacon of light at the top of the hill, but there's so much fog around it as well. How do we as leaders talk to ourselves so we can start to see that beacon of light?
Yeah, I think that's a very appropriate question, and I'll begin by offering one of the common sayings in the consulting world, and that saying is, content may be king, but context is a god. The context here for leaders is this: there's no playbook for a pandemic. None of us have ever experienced anything like this. I've been around 4 decades, but I can tell you I've never seen anything that literally forced every company, every industry virtually to shut their doors. So I think when we talk about internal dialogue, we acknowledge the fact that there is no cookie cutter approach that says, if you do this and then this and then this, then good things will happen. The greatest leaders embrace the ambiguity, the uncertainty, and say, I'm stronger than this situation, and I'll find a way. I wrote a blog right as the pandemic unfolded that represented some of the insights I've gleaned that I think people look for from leaders that hopefully reflects their internal dialogue. And it was a message that said, hey, here's what you should be looking for from your company and from your senior leaders. Number one, you need to hear a message that says we value you as a person, not just the contributor, but the person. Number two, we're going to treat you like an adult. Sometimes companies can lose sight of that, especially when everything is rolling along. They can lose sight of the fact that that may be the most important thing of all. Number three, trust is more than ideal. We really are going to try to live it. There's an old saying that says, when you talk about vision statements and all the things that oftentimes float around on the walls, people believe that, but they only believe it when moments of crisis arise. Then they'll see whether or not you believe it too. I think that's a very big thing. Number four, we're going to take action. I talk about in some of my seminars the lessons of history where great leaders, when faced with adversity, hunkered down and waited for the clouds to clear. One of the things we talked about in one of our conversations was not to malign the military record of George McClellan, but in the Civil War, great strategist, great tactician, Lincoln removed him because he was such a strategist and such a tactician, but he didn't take action in some of the pivotal battles. So we have to take action and let people know that we're moving forward. Finally, we have to make sure we honor our values. And then I think one of the most important things for a senior leader is he or she has to be prepared when they don't have all the answers to say 3 words that sometimes are forgotten in the English language. I don't know. It's okay to say, I don't know. You're not certain, I'm not certain, but I think if we can convey to people that this situation will pass, we're going to get through it together. More often than not, that helps others begin to gain confidence in the mission ahead.
Tim, really powerful stuff. I love so much of what you said, and for a lot of personal reasons as well, your notion about taking action. For us, it's right in our DNA. Our name ACTO comes from Act Today. And what was interesting was, as this was playing out, I completely agree with you. We couldn't find, there was no Google search terms that could give us the immediate answer. So we had to go out there and build our own 5-point crisis blueprint. And what we said was, hey, we'll just prioritize decision over precision here. Let's take a human-centric approach. And thanks to the guidance that I got from you, we said, here's the 5 things that we want to focus on as a priority, which is creating that integration of effort. I know you talk a lot about integration of effort and purpose in your works. Would love to hear how the relevance of that confluence in today's world, and what can leaders do to create that alignment in their organizations as the crisis continues to unfold?
Yeah, well, I appreciate the question. And just for the benefit of our listeners, one of the things that we talk about in some of our workshops and executive coaching sessions is that whether you manage a group of 5 or 5,000, there are 3 characteristics that typify great companies. And you can see it in the truly great, and you can find its absence in the mediocre. Every great team and every great company, first of all, enjoys, to your point, a constancy of purpose. They know why they are in existence, what they're challenged with accomplishing, and they make certain that every member of the team, whether, again, 5 or 5,000, understands that. Constancy of purpose is arguably the most important piece for any company. I've learned over the years that great teams, great companies, great armies are not built on the strength of conscription. They're built on the strength of purpose. You can't volunteer people into becoming a great company. You can hopefully enroll them and give them a sense of something that is greater. And if you do that, your chances of being successful. So constancy of purpose is the first. The second piece is exactly what you said. You have to ensure integration of effort. People have to understand what their role is, how it fits into the greater whole, and recognize that what they do makes a difference. And then the third piece is shared ownership in the results. If you have constancy of purpose, if you have integration of effort, and if you have shared ownership, your chances of building a successful team increase exponentially. How do you do that? Well, hopefully you build an environment where people recognize that you value them from a standpoint of who they are, what they bring to the team, and what they hope to build for the future. I oftentimes talk about the 5 questions that I've used over the years to help people look at what great leaders do. And you've heard me say this before, Parth. I spent years in 1982. I moved into management in 1984. That's kind of sobering when you say that. But when I went into management, I spent a lot of time looking at the few people I ran into that I thought were transformative leaders. And I mentioned the first. And for a long time, I looked at these people and I said, what is it that they're doing that makes me think so differently about them? And I spent hours and hours studying it. And then one day I had an epiphany and I realized it's not so much what they do that makes me think differently about them. It's what they do that make me think differently about me, which speaks to the core of your question. And I found that there were 5 questions that I always ask of those leaders, at least intuitively. Number 1, is this person credible? Because if they're not credible, you're not going to spend time with them. Number 2, can they help make me better? If they can't improve my station in life, probably not going to listen to them. But then I began to get into a different realm. I began to think about things that really, I think, distinguish managers and leaders. The really great ones, I can always ask the question, is this person committed to a vision of excellence that I can buy into? And that changed things for me, because then I began to realize the really great leaders have a vision of this shining city on the hill that sometimes I can't imagine myself, but I realize they do. And I join them. And then the last two questions, do you care about me? And can I trust you? And those latter two questions, in moments of crisis, they're the difference maker.
Absolutely. And that's where this all of this comes a full circle. That's where being human gives you that not an advantage, but it's an opportunity really for leaders to rise to the occasion and demonstrate who they are for their teams.
Well said.
Tim, what I find really fascinating and interesting as a student, as a lifelong student of leadership, is that, as you said, there is no playbook to this. That this is quite different and unprecedented, yet there's so many common elements where, to give my tech geeky approach to this, it's almost as if there is this leadership operating system, and you're able to run different applications on that every day. You wake up, you're taking on different projects, different strategies, and you're essentially, the core is that leadership operating system. Now in the world that we're in, here's this buggy software that's just popped up on our screen that we've never seen before. And it's big and bulky, and it's challenging that operating system. Maybe the machine might shut down. So that's my little tech geek spin to a lot of this. What I found fascinating also in our previous dialogues was just the while this is a different scenario, going back to the same theme, there are leaders that have gone through crisis in the past. Would love for you to give us and our listeners today just some historic perspective, which can also help them give that emotional fuel to start to see that shining city at the top of the hill.
Yeah, well, it's a question that I appreciate. And Parth, I'm a student of history. My dad was a school teacher, and early on I began to appreciate that. I think it was George Santayana that said, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. And particularly in moments of crisis, that is particularly true. The cardinal points that I used for my career began with personal accountability. And personal accountability meant this yearning to continue to learn. When it came to leadership, two things that I think became a saving grace for me. Number one, I spent a lot of time looking at leaders that I admired in the contemporary world, whether they were in business or government or across the globe. I would look at them and I would study them and I would ask questions to try and understand what made them so very effective. And by the way, there's a difference in effective leaders and efficient managers. Efficient managers do things right. Effective leaders do what's right. And there's a big difference there. So I would look at those contemporary leaders, number one. And then number two, to your point, I've spent a lot of time historically looking at what did leaders do in some of the greatest moments of crises. We talked about this before. This is the event of our lifetime, this pandemic. But humankind has experienced crises before. 1918, 1919, the Spanish flu. 1 out of every 3 people in the globe contracted the disease. And somewhere between 50 and 100 million people died. And by the way, we had this thing called World War I going on at the same time. And so I look at that and remind myself that we have endured as a species adversity like this before, and we will endure through this. And then I look to individuals that I think demonstrate crisis leadership. And I'd mentioned to you before, I'm a big fan of Nancy Kane's book, Forged in Crisis. In fact, 2 books that I would say, if you're really serious about being a crisis leader, that you should read. One is Forged in Crisis by Nancy Kane. The other is Leadership in Turbulent Times by Doris Kearns Goodwin. They should be on every leader's bookshelf. And I don't know either of them, but I love their work. But particularly the first book honors the memory of Ernest Shackleton, who you and I have talked about before, led 3 expeditions to the Antarctic all three of them failed. But the third became the stuff of legend when he managed to keep his men alive, 28, through a horrific situation that frankly stuns. And he did that because I think he recognized one of the critical skill sets, and it goes back to a question you asked earlier. He recognized the power of optimism. I think he said once, optimism is true moral courage. And in a world of cynicism, which is rampant right now, I think optimism is a superpower. And I encourage leaders to understand you may be down, but if you don't help your team understand what's required to move forward by being optimistic yourself, you're never going to get there. There is a wonderful quote, and I'll leave it there when we talk about historical leaders, and I'll slaughter it. But there were contemporaries of Shackleton. One of them was a guy named Raymond Priestley. And 40 to 50 years after Shackleton's death, he was addressing the British House, talking about those incredible explorers, Robert Falcon Scott, who failed to get to Antarctica, the pole, he died. Roald Amundsen, who was the first to get there. And Priestley said, for scientific discovery, give me Scott. For speed and efficiency of travel, give me Amundsen. But when you're in a hopeless situation and all hope is lost, get down on your knees and pray for Shackleton. That was a leader.
Absolutely. Tim, powerful notions around the value of transformative leadership in times of crisis. And that historic context is definitely helpful as a reminder, like I said, to help us construct that vision of what the future can look like. And Tim, would love to hear from you just your findings around how deep is this crisis in the life sciences industry. I consider folks like us we're like bumblebees, where we have the privilege to go from one flower to another and construct that full view of the garden, so to speak. So what are you finding in the life sciences industry? How deep is the crisis, and how's it essentially impacting the industry?
I'll answer that in two ways. One, macro level. If we stop to consider what's happened, the virus was identified in December of 2019. Within 30 days, it's genetically sequenced. That's because of life science companies. And in the time since, and you know this, Parth, better than I, because you're working with some of those companies, we have managed to move to the point that there are well over 100 trials underway that look at either testing or treatment or vaccines, which I think is just phenomenal. And I look at the healthcare providers as the heroes of the moment, the first line, the infantry that's fighting this incredible battle. That's the battle. The war will be won, as you know, by life science companies working in concert with the various government agencies and the oversight associations. And that, frankly, gives me hope for the future and reminds me again how critically important life sciences are. So that's the first question. In terms of commercial life sciences, I think the ramifications are so vast that you could spend 5 hours talking about them. I'll give you an example. Healthcare providers. December 2019, telemedicine kind of, sort of happened, not very much. Now, for some practices, 50 to 60 to 70% of their practice is telemedicine. Now they enjoy reimbursements for telemedicine that they didn't 4 months ago. As systems look at making a financial return, I think the chances of telemedicine being a part of the future are pretty high. What that means for commercial life science companies, we better rethink how we interact with clients, because it's not always going to be the brick and mortar approach where we send out the Red Army and we try to see as many physicians as we can and we give them a clinical message, marketing message, and a sample. Now I think the value proposition and the medium with which we contact those people is going to be forever changed.
Tim, thank you for sharing that. And in our discussions previously, within this new world for life sciences, you'd mentioned that data would play a different, unique role. Would love to get your thoughts on just what is the role that data and different technologies play in the new normal, so to speak. I know virtual is on everyone's mind right now.
Right. The simple answer is pretty much everything. I used as an example in one of my meetings recently, I held up my phone and made the comment that the average 15-year-old now has access to more data and information than Einstein and Aristotle and Socrates, than the libraries of Alexandria had. And yet that doesn't transfer into wisdom. It simply means we have a lot of data. I think a lot of people, frankly, are overloaded and drunk on information and deprived when it comes to insights. And so my answer to this is this: the best companies, I think, understand that data and information plays a role, but it has to be transferred and converted into knowledge. And from that knowledge, there has to be insights gleaned. And from that insight comes wisdom, and hopefully that informs the strategy. I think commercial life science companies, whether that's pharma or medical or surgery or dental, and that's really where most of my practice resides, we have a lot of sources of data. Challenge is, for a lot of companies, we're like great lurching giants where we lumber across the landscape, and we have medical affairs looking at one thing, research looking at one thing, marketing looking at one thing, sales looking at one thing, economics and sometimes the database is a different database. A lot of companies, I think, recognize this in the last 10 years, but we're slow to change. The really insightful companies are going to recognize that if you're going to be successful in the new world, you're going to have a strategy that's driven by insights, and that insight is going to be gleaned from a common database that everyone is looking at, not just sales or not just marketing. And I know that's an area that you guys devote a lot of time to, but I think it's probably going to be at the epicenter of the new world.
Absolutely. Putting people at the center, putting data and technology at the center, certainly a lot. We're at the cusp of so much change. Tim, I know you have such wealth of experience within the life sciences organization from so many different paradigms. So to get the most out of all the wonderful insights you have and the stories you have, I've created a new segment for our conversation today, which is Lab to Bedside. So would love to get your thoughts. Let's imagine all the right stakeholders as we take our patient-centric drugs and devices from lab to the bedside. If they were all in this proverbial room and we could share one insight, one nugget of gold with them, what would that be? So it's kind of a rapid fire where I'll I'll bring them into the room and Tim, let's have a quick chat with them. So starting with my personal favorite, and we've talked so much about people and being human, it's fitting that we bring in our commercial learning and development folks in first. If they're in this proverbial room looking to construct their vision of the future, what advice do we give them today?
Yeah, three things come to mind. One, the venue and how you go about training is going to have to change. The days of flying people across the country for either initial headquarter or the brand launch or whatever it might be is probably going to undergo some metamorphosis. So the vehicles, virtual training, and the various vehicles that make you successful are going to have to transform. That's the first thing. Second thing is content's going to need to move from being primarily focused on two things, product training and selling skills, to a broader base that looks at business and includes a lot of areas that the traditional rep is not really well versed on. And then the third piece, and this is true for every division, your greatest resource, if you believe that strategy is the intelligent allocation of limited resources and unique set of activities to gain competitive advantage, and that's a mouthful, but that's really what it is. Your greatest resource is human capital. You better be cultivating that human capital in ways that you never have before.
Love it, Tim. Up next, let's bring our head of sales into the room. What do we tell them?
I think a lot of what we've talked about, but maybe with a little bit of a nuance, much of the pharmaceutical model, and this is true really to a certain degree with medical and dental, it's an old reach and frequency model that said clinical message, marketing message, close for action, leave them a sample, and out the door you go. That's why most HCPs think the greatest value is a sample. that's probably not going to get us to where we need to be in the future. So we want to think about what that message is. We used to say, when I ran sales divisions, we said there's 4 things that we want our sales teams to think about. We called it the core 4, which gives you a hint at my creativity or lack thereof. Targeting, messaging, resourcing, and collaboration. Every one of those is going to have to change.
Powerful. Tim, and close kin of sales is up next. Our head of marketing is in the room. What do we tell head of marketing?
Sales is a tactical arm, but only one of the tactical arms. Your challenge is to make sure that you're looking at that rich database that hopefully exists someplace in the bowels of your company, and that you're looking at the same information that sales is looking at, that R&D is looking at, that clinical is looking at, that outcomes is looking at, and not simply going to a different data source and coming up with a different conclusion. We talked before about integration of effort. Integration of effort begins there. And by the way, the insight generating machine for your company should be marketing.
Absolutely. And speaking of integration of effort, so let's go to the glacial source of it all, the clinical data. What do we tell our head of R&D who's in the room with us?
Yeah, and I mentioned this earlier, Parth. I have to offer this disclaimer. My work with R&D was always from afar. But I think the best companies, the companies that I work with now, have built an alliance, recognizing that there are proprietary differences and guidelines that have to be in place. But the very best R&D departments are also looking at a lot of the same database in order to make informed decisions. You're not a different company. You're hopefully looking at some of the same resources in order to make informed decisions. And that, I think, this notion of integration of effort really does begin if you've got a clinical team that understands and looks at the same sources as do those other departments that we just talked about.
Absolutely. Tim, crossing the bounds just a little bit on the organization, going outside the organization, to our healthcare providers. And I also want to take this opportunity to give them a shout out for all the wonderful work that's being done on the front line. What do we tell them about what the new world of healthcare and life sciences may look like?
Yeah, I think I might twist or turn that a little bit. I think I'd like to ask them, what do you see as the new world being, and how can we better fulfill our obligation to offer legitimate value? I think those questions are going to help us mutually build that new world. I'll give you, for instance, adherence compliance is a massive issue right now. A lot of people that were on 90-day scripts have dropped their prescription. I think if we can ask the right people the right questions, we can probably do a better job of meeting them in the middle. I think we also have to think about, as we said earlier, do we have a strategy that really matches the new world, or is it a strategy that's steeped in a past that no longer exists? So I think the questions are probably going to be maybe more important than anything that we can say to that healthcare provider, if that makes sense.
Absolutely. It does, Tim. And it also speaks to how we'll have to think about things out of box, and really challenging the notions of how a life sciences company has traditionally functioned. And in that vein, what role do you think the life sciences organization, commercial organization in particular, what role do they play in total solution delivery? And do we, in this new world, do our patients part of the dialogue as well? And if so, how do we draw the line from the organization out to, obviously there is a clear line to the HCPs, but also perhaps including patients in this new virtual world?
I think, to answer your question, patients have to be a part. One of the outcomes of COVID is we're going to have a more educated patient base. My friends, my contemporaries in my personal life are much more well educated today than they were 6 months ago. And I think we all will be. Now, how life science companies interact with patients, there are proprietary guidelines that we have to be mindful of, but I think the patient does have to be a part of that equation. I think the other thing that we have to think about, and this speaks a little bit to what you're talking about, for a lot of life science companies, I think that one of the things we're going to have to think about is a little bit more of a business to business mindset. than we probably had in the past. I keep going back to so much of life science commercial business is a little bit of it's a reach and frequency model. Let me give you information, let me put a sample in your hand, and out the door we go. And that's not where HCPs reside any longer. I think that we're probably going to, and this speaks to what you said earlier, if we can connect the dots internally, speaking of a life science company, and get medical economics talking to reimbursement people, talking to clinical people, talking to sales leaders, talking to marketing. The toughest part for a lot of life science companies is connecting the dots internally. So our face to the customer is more aligned than it has been in the past. We suffer sometimes from internal schizophrenia. We can't afford to do that anymore. Does that answer your question?
It does, and why I loved, Tim, what you shared is we talked about that hope and the shining light. This is now giving us a more concrete blueprint of what that can look like in reality. So the final stakeholder that walks into the room, who's at the helm of all of this within the life sciences organization to tie it all together, the CEO. If we're talking to the CEO, what do we tell her? What does this new normal look like, and what can she do in driving our organization forward?
I think we hopefully have a dialogue with her that talks about three things. We talk about leading people, managing the business, and building the future. And I believe the best CEOs are looking at that in two ways. They're looking at the business strategy that you alluded to earlier, which again means assessing your resources and coming up with the unique activities that give you advantage. That's the traditional approach. But the really best CEOs, I think, are looking at this notion of human capital in ways that they didn't before. I know I've shared with you before, if you look at disengagement figures pre-pandemic across the globe, 85% of the workforce globally is disengaged. I wonder how disengaged they're going to be now after the greatest crisis of this century, probably even more so. CEOs are going to recognize, if I can cultivate human capital, if I can build a generation of leaders that then cultivates workers to a higher degree, I'm going to be able to realize that business strategy because I've realized the most important resource at my disposal is people, which carries us back to the very first point that you made in this discussion.
And there you have it. Tim, that brings us a full circle to where we started about being human as we learn to respond to the new normal and as we lead our teams towards a better world. Thank you again for a wonderful, powerful discussion, Tim. And thank you to all of our listeners for tuning in. Once again, Tim's book is called The Compass Solution. I highly recommend it, and it has helped me a great deal as I found my personal North Star and helped my team find their North Star as well. Also, for all of our listeners, there is a strategy sheet down below if you want to quickly review and share the insights that Tim very generously shared with us today. Feel free to download the strategy sheet, and we'll meet you again next month with a new change agent. Tim, I wish you the best in the meantime.
Thank you, Parth.
If you found value in our podcast and know of a change agent who is working to disrupt the life sciences industry, please nominate them using the form below.